A traumatized police chief tries to overcome her fears but ends up affecting her whole existence. At a restaurant, Sarah seems distracted while her partner, Mario, rambles about gang members Harris and Bakshi returning to the States despite the risks. He then asks for Sarah's french fries and calls them fingers. This snaps her back into reality, so she corrects him that they're french fries. Mario thinks they're on a wild goose chase, but Sarah insists that their suspects will be there and will lead them to their boss, Colin. Seeing her being emotional about it, Mario suggests that she needs a break, but Sarah insists that she's fine, so she pays their bills and leaves. On their way back to the precinct, Mario reminds Sarah that she's not handling the case alone because the massacre affected their entire department. 3 of the victims were even in Mario's class at the academy, so he also wants to find Colin and the group responsible for their deaths. Later at home, Sarah's wife, Katie, finds her drinking her woes away, so she gives her a massage to comfort her. During this, Sarah notes how everyone wants her to move on, yet every time she closes her eyes, she finds herself back in the street, hearing the gunshots as if it's happening again. Katie assures her that it's in the past, but Sarah feels like part of her is still there, lying in a pool of blood and waiting for her turn to be killed. Hoping to ease her fears, Katie shows her a device that'll grant her another life. She likens this to being someone else in a dream with new rules and reality. Sarah wonders who she'll be in the other world, but Katie notes that every user's experience is different since the new persona will be based on the user's thoughts and dreams. She insists that it's a vacation from her real life, which convinces Sarah to try. Katie prepares the device for her wife, programming it for 2 hours as a trial. If Sarah dislikes it, she can just return it. She hopes for Sarah to get a break from being herself, to which her wife responds that she doesn't deserve Katie for being too caring. Afterward, Sarah activates the device and wakes up as a man named George. Another man, Chris, helps him up since he's bleeding from his head. George is clueless about what's happening, but Chris thinks he's joking. Chris grabs his gun, but again corners them and brings them to their boss, Colin. Colin accuses George of having done something, adding that he could have avoided that incident if he'd done what he asked. He then orders his men to grab George and put his hand on the table. He threatens to cut his finger off and let him eat it. George panics as Colin places a blade on his hand, teasingly aiming for his fingers. Desperate, he pushes himself free and starts fighting their captors. This allows Chris to steal a gun and start shooting, but Colin gets away. Chris tries shooting at Colin's car, but it still drives off. As George zones out, Chris tells him to run before the police arrive. As they arrive at their car, George is confused that the vehicle is manually driven, unlike their smart cars in real life, so he lets Chris drive instead. Noticing his odd behavior, Chris suggests calling Paula, but George doesn't know who she is. With this, Chris thinks he's losing his memories, so he asks if he remembers him, to which George does. Concerned, Chris drives him home. At home, Paula checks George and thinks he has a concussion, so she advises him to stay up for the next 6 hours. George points out that his memories are slowly returning, so Paula tests this by asking personal questions. During this, George recalls being a billionaire who owns a company named Avacom Data System. Paula is glad that his memory is recovering, so she prepares to leave. However, she stops and asks George if he wants her to stay, to which he declines but thanks her. After she leaves, Chris enters and informs him that the police found the bodies but haven't tracked down Colin. When George hears the name, he sees flashbacks of him and starts to panic. Seeing this, Chris attempts to call Paula, but George stops him since his problem is mental, and he feels the urge to cry. Chris tries to comfort him, sympathizing that it's not easy to get over what happened. This triggers another memory of a gunshot, making George feel frightened. Chris advises him to sleep, but Paula told him he must stay up for 6 hours. Considering this, Chris suggests going on a vacation without leaving the house using George's creation, a prototype headset similar to Sarah's device. He wonders if he could use the headset, but George recalls that since each headset has a neuronic pulse map that is uniquely designed for the user's prefrontal cortex, all Chris will see with his headset are white lines. This is something he'd explained before when he introduced the device to his company. George then thanks Chris and wears the headset. Seconds later, he returns to Sarah's life. Confused, Sarah stands and checks the window to make sure she's back to herself. She notices that it's already morning, even though Katie timed the vacation to only work for 2 hours. Later, Sarah meets up with Mario at the restaurant, where he rambles on again about how if her hunch is correct, then 4 of the most wanted criminals risk staying in the States. Sarah doesn't pay attention and notices a man scooping ice and another man drinking tea. Suddenly, she asks Mario if the food tastes different since she doesn't taste anything. She then apologizes for not listening since she feels like she's somewhere else. Mario thinks that the vacation really affected her since he never saw her that distracted. He then asks again if he can eat her fries, but still calls them fingers. Afterward, Sarah explains her vacation, saying that it is like a coherent dream. She remembers how the longer she was there, the more familiar the world was to her, as if she remembered a different life. The eerie part is that she also remembered her real life there, but it was as if she was recalling it for the first time. Suddenly, Mario receives a report about the gang setting up a meeting with Colin in the city. This confirms Sarah's hunch, though she becomes suspicious, thinking that the gang easily fell onto their laps. Nevertheless, they head to the location. During the investigation, Sarah recognizes the place as the one where she woke up as George. They spot Harris and Bakshi walking, so they quietly follow them and see them meet with Colin. Colin discusses his new plan with his gang, saying they will destroy the political foundation by nuking the city hall. Before saying further, Colin invites the men to discuss inside their place. Seeing this, Mario tries to call for backup but can't get a signal, so he leaves. Suddenly, a man ambushes Sarah from behind, but she manages to fight back and runs. However, another man chases her and throws a stun device at her, making her collapse. As she loses consciousness, she returns to George's body. While walking to his meeting, George suddenly feels dizzy as Sarah takes over, but he refuses help and just asks for water. They proceed to a meeting with the Justice Department, who accuse George of wandering around town like a real-life Bruce Wayne. His lawyer defends that he hasn't been involved in such things, stressing that he's still recovering from his wife's murder video going viral. This triggers George's memory of a video where a woman was held at gunpoint and beaten up. The panic attack causes him to throw up, thus ending the meeting. He returns home and Paula checks him, diagnosing him with a severe concussion that's affecting his memory. George points out he doesn't want to remember everything, though he's confused about how a hit on the head caused him to forget his wife. He also notices that he doesn't have her pictures in his house, so Paula recounts that he had them taken away after she passed. She mentions that his wife's name is Katie, alarming George. The woman pulls up a photo of his wife from her phone and he sees that his wife is the same Katie from the real world. This triggers his memory of this world's Katie, making him emotional. However, the memory is mixed with Katie's murder and the real Katie with Sarah in the other world. Confused, he tells Paula that there are two Katies. Having heard a story of another life, Paula thinks it's déjà vu, which is simply a delay in transmitting real-time information from one hemisphere to another. When the second hemisphere receives it, it creates a brief dissonance in perception, causing the cerebral cortex to misinterpret it as memory and leading the brain to assume that an event has happened twice. However, George feels it's not déjà vu since the memories are real. Paula points out that the memories are simulated events from his VR headset, so his brain might be having problems processing them. When he's not convinced, Paula points out that in this other world, he's a super cop with a flying car and married to Katie, who's still alive and well. She comments that it's like a digital fantasy, which might render him losing his grip on reality. His virtual experiences might be hindering his recovery, and he could end up with permanent or severe brain damage. Thinking this, George relents and promises to stop using his headset. However, when Paula leaves, he immediately uses the device and returns to Sarah. As Sarah wakes up at a hospital, Katie and Mario greet her and reveal that Colin and the gang were captured after backup arrived. However, Sarah feels like everything is a dream. Later at home, Sarah and Katie make love. Katie sarcastically asks if she doesn't make love with others during the vacation, to which Sarah confirms. This surprises Katie, assuring her wife that it won't be cheating since it's just a dream. Seeing Sarah distracted, she gets concerned and asks what happened. Sarah shares her life on vacation, where she's a widower whose wife was killed. Katie thinks that it's a story of heartbreak and revenge, so she asks if the killer was found, but Sarah says no. Seeing her expression, Katie realizes that the other world feels real for Sarah. She admits this, especially since her wife in the dream was also Katie. This bothers Katie, thinking that her wife imagined her being murdered on this vacation. Sarah defends that she didn't control it, though she notes that there were other things in reality that are similar to her other world, like how Colin is also there and both worlds have the virtual reality device. Horrified, Katie reminds her that there's only one world, but for Sarah, there are two. She remembers everything that happens in both worlds, but everything in this one is foggy and confusing when she's in Georgia's. Katie insists that this is reality, but Sarah notes that her life is like a sci-fi fantasy with a flying car and a hot wife. She wonders if she deserves such a perfect life. This makes Katie recall how Sarah questioned if she deserved her as a wife. She thought she was kidding at the time, but now Katie thinks it was Sarah's subconscious talking. She notes that the device's program designs a scenario based on the hidden desires and dreams of the user to create a new life. Katie figures that Sarah is racked with guilt over the massacre, so she created a world where her wife is dead and she's tortured with guilt. She suggests going to the hospital to remove all her memories of the program, but Sarah thinks it isn't a good idea. Still, Katie insists and asks her wife to trust her, so she agrees. As Katie sleeps, however, Sarah reconsiders her life. She looks at Katie and to the world beyond her window, still wondering if this is real or simply George's fantasy. To help her decide, Sarah uses the device again and returns to the other world. There, George wanders outside and sees the restaurant where Sarah and Mario usually eat. He goes inside and the waiter greets him like he's a regular customer. Chris also arrives and tells him that the feds don't have enough evidence to press charges against them, but Colin left the country. During this, George notices the food, the waiter scooping, and the man drinking tea, similar to the last time Sarah was eating at that restaurant. He grabs a fry and notes that it's not a finger, which confuses Chris. At home, George sees Paula waiting for him, though he already predicted that she'd be there. She explains that Chris called her, saying that he's worried about him. George tells her not to worry anymore and states that he'll be selling his company to anyone interested. Paula thinks he's crazy, but he doesn't care as he's decided that this is not the real world. When he checks for his headset, however, he sees that it's gone. George questions Paula about this, but she reminds him that he isn't supposed to use it anymore. She advises him to talk, but George stresses that she's not his therapist. Still, Paula insists that she's his friend, but all he's focusing on is finding the headset. George explains that the VR headset is the easiest way to return to reality, but Paula insists that their world is real. George refuses to argue further since Paula is just a fantasy. He demands for his headset, but Paula questions this real world where Katie is still alive. Infuriated, George yells at her to give him the headset. Tearfully, Paula takes the headset from her bag but warns George that his cerebral cortex will be damaged and he might never wake up. George doesn't care as he finally realizes how great his life as Sarah is. Hearing this, Paula comments that his life there is a little too perfect, but George notes that he argued the same thing to the real Katie. Paula points out that if that's his real world, then he shouldn't need the headset to return there. He argues that there's just something wrong with the simulation since the product was new. Despite this, he doesn't care as long as he returns to his real world. Paula insists that he's escaping the real world, so she makes him listen before he never returns to his real life. Holding his hand, Paula reminds him of their history. George had an affair with Paula before his wife disappeared. They were supposed to end it, but Colin took Katie as he wanted the software that George made for the NSA. The software would have let Colin hack into the US intelligence community and get the nuclear launch codes. George offered billions to save Katie, but Colin didn't want money and killed her. After Katie's death, George made the headset to escape the pain of losing his wife. Confused, George refuses to believe that the world he is in is real, but Paula asks which one sounds more like a fantasy. The world where he's grieving his murdered wife or the one where she's alive. Tearfully, George struggles to decide which life is real, so Paula lets him choose but reminds him that if he uses the headset, he might go into a permanent coma. On the bright side, he'll be in his sci-fi paradise with Katie. However, he can still choose to stay with Paula and face all their troubles together. Comparing his life as George and her life as Sarah, he decides that he never deserved the latter. Paula agrees that they neither deserve such a perfect life. Instead, this is the world they're meant to live in as punishment for their sins. With that, he destroys the headset, choosing to live the painful life as George. In a hologram projecting Sarah's dream, Katie sees George make his choice. Unwilling to believe this, she tries to shake her wife awake, but Sarah remains catatonic. The doctor declares that Sarah's neuronal path has shut down, so they can't wake her anymore. Next to Katie, Mario questions why Sarah would choose that life. As they watch Sarah's dream, where George cries into Paula's arms, Katie realizes that her wife wanted to be punished for her sins, both the real ones and those she imagined. Even being happy with her was a sin for Sarah. Mario disagrees that happiness is a sin, but Katie knows Sarah thought otherwise. With that, Katie kisses her wife goodbye.
Subscribe to watch more videos like this. Turn on notifications. And leave a like, it really helps the channel out. Thank you for watching.